everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 200 libraries across 37 states with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful, best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our Author Talk series year-round. Today, we are honored and excited to have scholar, speaker, strategist, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and so much more, Dr. Marcia Chatelain, join us for an exciting chat about her book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. Welcome, Dr. Chatelain. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I'm excited to get to visit so many libraries without having to leave my home. So I'm really excited for this opportunity.
Good. We are super excited to have you here today. But let me pause for one moment and give some quick housekeeping information, and then we'll dive right in and learn a little bit more about our guest today. So we have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we will also be taking your additional questions throughout this entire conversation. So when you have a direct question for Dr. Chatelain, please click the questions button below the live stream video to submit that question. As we progress through the talk, or even if you have a question right now, go ahead and click that and submit the question. Also, feel free to interact with your fellow viewers in the new live chat box below the stream as well. As a reminder, if you are unable to attend the full talk for any reason whatsoever, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours. And in that email, you can find a link to the recording. Okay, so now to formally introduce our guest for today. Dr. Marcia Chatelain is a professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University. In addition to Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, she is also the author of Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration. In 2021, Dr. Chatelain received the Pulitzer Prize in History for her book Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. In addition, she is a recipient of the Hagley Prize in Business History and the Organization of American Historians Lawrence W. Levine Award for Franchise. And very recently, the James Beard Award for Writing, also for Franchise. So that's exciting too. As an active public speaker and educational consultant, Dr. Chatelain has received awards and honors from the Ford Foundation, the American Association of University Women, and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. In 2016, the Chronicle of Higher Education named her a top influencer in academia in recognition of her social media campaign, #Ferguson Syllabus, which implored educators to facilitate discussions about the crisis in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. So welcome, Dr. Chatelain. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I am good. You know, it's so exciting. I just want to say something about the public libraries one more time. You know, I'm a native of Chicago, and in many ways, the path to writing both of my books was really about growing up in Chicago. But I really think that, you know, the first step in my career was really spending time at the public library, doing the summer reading programs, and now as a scholar, going to university libraries and special collections and archives, and really just enjoying the fact that we have these public goods available to broaden our knowledge and to build community.
Yeah, that's the perfect segue to how we love to start our talk. Because of course we're huge fans of libraries around here, as you've gleaned. So we like to start with three kind of targeted, focused questions about libraries. And you may have already answered the first quick question, which is, what library did you visit most as a child? The Chicago Library?
Chicago Public Library. It was on Clark. I think it might have been considered the Rogers Park branch. Fantastic. And in Washington, or in Chicago, we also have the incredible Harold Washington Library, one of the most beautiful libraries in the United States. And now that I'm the mother of a 1-year-old, I go spend a lot of time at story time every week at the Cleveland Park Library in Washington, D.C.
Oh, very nice. So what then would be your favorite library in the world, and why?
I think that oh wow, this is like picking a favorite child when you're a historian. I think the archival wonders that I have found at the University of Chicago Special Collections Library, as well as Howard University's Moreland Spingarn collection, just to think about the incredible effort it has taken over the years to archive African American history, that I think, our Black History archives are just amazing, amazing resources. And the Schiller Library in New York City as well.
That's a great answer. Such a good answer. So the last question then is, if the last library on Earth were on fire, what book would you save?
Oh no. I would try to save, I would say Toni Morrison's Beloved, because I can't think of a more enduring piece of fiction that also speaks to the nation's complicated history.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing. Thank you for that. And thank you for your shout out to libraries. We're always super appreciative, especially when we have a huge library lover and advocate in our midst. So thank you. Okay, so I want to start off then with, okay, a Pulitzer, a James Beard. Have you had time to celebrate this or been able to with COVID? All of these accolades in the last 2 years?
I have had an amazing, amazing experience with this book. I'm so grateful for just everyone who supported this kind of strange, weird book that talks about McDonald's and civil rights and the same kind of idea. But, I had an 8-week-old baby when I won the Pulitzer Prize. And so between like the exhaustion of a newborn and then the kind of malaise of COVID, I kind of didn't think any of it was real. And so a lot of the celebrations have actually just been at home with my son and my husband and very close friends. We haven't had big parties yet, but of all the various award ceremonies that has honored the book, the one I was able to attend was the Pulitzer Prizes. And I think the best part of it was that I was able to bring my 1-year-old to New York City and have him stay with my best friend of 25 years so his mom could get the Pulitzer Prize. And I'm sure he'll be so over that story when I tell it to him constantly when he gets older. But, I want to say something about the recognition for the book. It's an incredible privilege to have. But I want to also say that, like, the incredible history that needed to kind of unfold in order for my book to be recognized in these different venues is not just about, celebrating history. It's about celebrating the importance of African American history. It's the fact that as a woman, I can have the kind of career that I have in academia. I think I'm the 10th woman to win in the category of history, and this year, 2 women won. And so it's all about just the changes that need to happen and are expanding our idea of what history looks like and who can write it. That I really think is at the heart of this incredible experience that I've had.
Yeah, that's amazing. And your book really does speak to so much, the importance for civil rights in history and even the modern day, because it's not we're not always taking what we should from our history lessons. But to get us started, and for maybe some of those who have not had the chance to read your book yet, can you walk us through some of the primary ideas and arguments in your book?
Well, what I examine is the historical roots of an enduring and pervasive social problem today. And that's the relationship between health outcomes and race. And one of the things that I wanted to engage people on is this question of how did fast food become such a fixture in Black neighborhoods and communities, considering the places where fast food first emerged. And that was roadside, highway rest stops, as well as predominantly white suburbs. And using McDonald's as the kind of text, I look at the ways that calls for greater economic opportunities for African Americans that accompanied the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. led to the rise of the fast food industry in African American communities. And I talk about the ways that the private sector and businesses particularly have tried to answer the calls for racial justice and the ways that those calls are facilitated by the federal government, by civil rights leaders, as well as people who imagine that business could be the kind of final step in getting racial and social equality. And I talk about some of the pitfalls of that strategy by looking at the period in which McDonald enters Black communities in 1968 up into the early 1990s.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So I'm really interested to know, so you go from South Side girls growing up in the Great Migration, which looks at histories of Black women and girls from their perspective, but as well as capitalism. But then you go into fast food history and how it relates to Black capitalism. So was that transition a natural one, or was it born out of just interest?
It was a little weird. I mean, usually historians try to stick to kind of one general topic. But for me, I think the through line between the two books is the centrality of Chicago in creating an environment for people to kind of consider ideas about racial progress and change. And so in my first book, the Great Migration is one of the most studied aspects of African American life after the Civil Rights Movement. And growing up in Chicago, we heard a lot of stories about Black Southerners and the way that they really fundamentally changed the landscape of the city. But no one ever talked about what that must have been like for girls and young women. And when I sit down to write a story, I want to think about, whose perspective did we not get? How do we have these kind of large pictures of the past or large ideas, and who do we not hear from? And so for that book, it was for girls and young women. And in writing Franchise, I thought about the ways that in our contemporary conversations about health and race and nutrition, what people should be eating, what Michelle Obama thinks you should be eating, all of these things, we rarely hear from the communities that have very complicated relationships to fast food. It's very easy to write a takedown book of the fast food industry. I think it's much harder to say, well, actually, it's not just about the food. It's about the community programs. It's about the ways that it symbolizes Black progress and Black wealth. It's about the evocation of King and his legacy. And so when you have the weight of history in these contemporary institutions, I think it changes your perspective on the reasons why some people embrace them and why some people reject them.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of touching on that as well, in your introduction in Franchise, you tell the reader that we're going to learn about the historical relationship between the struggle for civil rights and the expansion of the fast food industry. Looking at that sentence on its face, you kind of think, okay, how did you come up with intertwining these two areas of history?
Well, so, growing up in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, there's a McDonald's that has a little plaque that says it's the first McDonald's that was owned and operated. And that's how they talk about franchising, owned and operated by an African American, a man named Herman Petty. And I saw that plaque a million times going to that McDonald's. And then I remember, as a high school student, my first engagement with African American history was because Black franchise owners in the area had paid for a quiz bowl competition for local high school students. And so I thought, this is kind of interesting to think about, Black cultural work being done by fast food franchisees. And then thinking about this plaque, and also in many ways, McDonald's, its second hometown is the Chicago area. And also growing up in a context where if you listen to Black radio, if you go to events that celebrate Black cultural institutions, there is the presence of Black franchise owners. And when I went away to college, I talked to people from cities like St. Louis and Detroit and Houston, and they had a similar story. And so when I had those experiences, I kind of filed them away. And then I thought to myself, wait a second, there's something happening here. So that when nutritionists and public health advocates are talking about communities of color in fast food, they're not acknowledging these kind of community ties that are strange, because McDonald's is a multi-billion global brand and company, but it can have some very specific meaning on the local level. And that's what I wanted to explore. And the roots of all of that was really 1968 when McDonald's started to recruit its first Black franchise owners.
Okay. And that, I think, naturally leads into questioning when you start to do research on this kind of topic, and we have several questions from our viewers on research in particular, does that change the way that you research as a historian? Are you then are you doing corporate research? Are you going to archives still? Are you conducting oral histories and doing interviews? Lisa, in particular, says, can you tell us a little bit about how you did your research for franchise and like what type of sources did you use?
I think that when I look back at my career, if I ever retire, I will say that the thing that I'm proudest of is that I was able to write a history of a corporation without having access to its archives. And this is something that can sometimes deter historians from doing this type of research. It could have deterred me had I not had, I think, the focus on African American communities. McDonald's has its own internal corporate archives. It has its own curator, museum, but it doesn't open it up to the public. And so as a result, I had this challenge of how was I going to get archival material on McDonald's without McDonald's, opening up their sources. And I think that was really great because it forced me to rethink the focus. So instead of saying, I want to go to an archive, do you have anything about McDonald's? I started to work backwards. What were the organizations that were supporting Black franchising? It was groups, legacy civil rights groups like the Urban League, the NAACP, even Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They all supported franchising as a tool for Black economic empowerment. So I went to their records and found all sorts of things about McDonald's. And for us today, it's really unusual for us to think about a time where McDonald's wasn't everywhere. But in the 1960s and early 70s, it was still a newer brand. And so I was able to go to the records of community groups that opposed McDonald's and their arguments for why McDonald's should or should not be in certain communities also opened up that story. And so I think in many ways, I was more creative and more thoughtful in my process, knowing that there wasn't just one place I could get this research. I don't know if I can ever write a book like Franchise Again. At the time, I didn't have kids. So I was on a plane, 3 times to Portland, 5 times to Los Angeles, down to Dallas to interview some franchise owners, in Chicago several times. I mean, this book took me to a lot of places where the story of McDonald's was kind of hiding in plain sight.
You make the life of a historian sound so glamorous to get to just jet set all over.
It's a lot of waking up, hurrying up the second the archive opens, using your phone to take as many pictures as documents as possible, skipping lunch, skipping bathroom breaks, getting back into your rental car and doing it over and over again.
So it doesn't sound, or maybe you did. Did you set out to focus on McDonald's, or is that where the research took you?
I knew that McDonald's had to be the entryway into this story because McDonald's in many ways it's not the oldest fast food brand and it's not the first, but I think that it created the form, whether it was in the ways that it centralized its operations, whether it the ways that fast food impacts the supply chain for goods. McDonald's kind of is the gold standard in a certain type of delivery method of food, and other fast food restaurants used their method very early on. But in terms of engaging African American consumers as well as recruiting franchise owners, McDonald's was the first and the foremost. And so it was because they were the first ones to take that step, they had to really be the anchor of the story.
Okay. So we have quite a few people curious about McDonald's cooperation, but I think you kind of answered that because you didn't have to access their archives. But Donna specifically said, could you let us know what kinds of information and what cooperation, if any, you were able to directly obtain from McDonald's? But it doesn't sound like any.
None.
Have they commented on your book since?
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I have been at, so my book came out in January 2020. So I was able to get in, I think, about 17 book events before COVID closed everything down. And I did, at a lot of events, there were people who worked for McDonald's corporate, former franchise owners, former suppliers that I've met along the way. And, a lot of them have a lot of mixed emotions about their experiences with McDonald's. I think McDonald's may feel like, my book doesn't fully explore their commitment to diversity, but rather my book looks at the kind of tensions that McDonald's didn't create, but McDonald's really exemplifies in the challenges of using kind of a corporate method and using businesses as the vehicle for some of these racial justice questions that haven't been fully answered. So I don't know if they love franchise, but I know that a lot of people within the McDonald's community have appreciated the book.
Okay. It's interesting to know that you've run into some of those people at talks to some of their employees, and they've let you know that they're McDonald's employees.
100%.
Yeah. So I'm intrigued by an article that you wrote for the Washington Post, why Popeyes markets and chicken sandwich to African Americans. And you state that the chicken craze should have stirred a conversation, quote, about the uneasy relationship among marketing, race and food stereotypes, and the way that these factors have combined to contribute to significant health consequences for African Americans. So because your book touches on this so much and your research touches on this so much, can you briefly talk about health, race, and fast food, and how it all relates to food justice, historically and contemporarily?
Yeah, I think that there is, sometimes people say, well, you think fast food should be, banned, or what, or do you eat French fries? People ask me that question. I do like French fries. I don't take the position that I should tell another person what they should or shouldn't eat. My primary concern is twofold. One, do we have a system, and we don't, in place where people can have as diverse of a diet as they desire? And what are the conditions for people who both harvest and process food, as well as people who prepare and deliver food to us? How are the conditions in which they work exacerbating problems of health and nutrition and justice? I think that we are in a moment right now where people are coming into a consciousness about, what we call food apartheid or food deserts, the inability for certain communities within a mile to access, a grocery store of high quality, affordable goods. We know that there are a lot of criticisms of both the fast food and cereal and soda and candy industry and how they market to youth and children. We know about all of this, but I think what we are lacking in this conversation is a really empathetic view of the constrained choices that people have that aren't just about having enough money to buy food, but also having enough time to enjoy meals, having to not rely on big companies like McDonald's to be both an employer and the provider of scholarships and the provider of Wi-Fi and the place where kids can hang out after school, and to be, the de facto senior center. And so I think what I'm really calling for is for us to be very introspective about what kind of public goods we have that are in the public trust that we can use to care for each other and keep corporations out of that process. And I think that, in many ways, the public library is one of the last institutions where you can just be without spending any money, without having to conform to, excessive rules of engagement, where people can just be and can just go. And I think increasingly we are losing sight that that's even possible. And I think it's because not only of the influence of corporations, but the fact that some communities have to rely on these corporations because they have been left behind in terms of public services and public goods.
Yeah, and a couple of things that you touched on just then got a flurry of questions from the viewers. DG asks, what can I do as an entry-level health educator, single Black mother, as it relates to promoting health in neighborhoods that once thrived, but are now food deserts, especially in the midst of COVID-19, the monkeypox virus, and God knows what else.
Seriously, I think that we have to start to really think about how members of the community can be contributors to what comes in and what comes out of the community. One of the things I chronicle in my book is that in the 1970s, fast food seemed like a really good idea for a lot of places that weren't getting new businesses, that didn't have jobs, that didn't really have an opportunity to patronize Black-owned businesses, and that was something that people wanted. And so, so I think from the hindsight of 2022, we can say, well, they were wrong. Well, no, they were making the best choices they had under the conditions. I think for right now, we have to start thinking about how we can collectivize responsibilities that allow people to engage more fully with food. And so what does that mean in terms of some of the networks we saw during COVID-19's height in terms of mutual aid? Everyone contributing what they had. There was someone, one of the mutual aid networks in my area, someone was good at baking bread, and that's what she did. And she was like delivering bread to people in a certain kind of area. The bread isn't the, end all and be all of eating, but that fresh bread means something in terms of communities taking care of each other. And I think also, I think that we have to really right size our goals for where we are. What do we have the capacity to do? And what are the ways that we can have victories in taking care of each other so that we can expand? But I think the best thing that you can do as a person in community is spend time talking to people about kind of what they need and really strategizing about how collectively we can make sure that people's needs are met.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So I want to dive into your book. We've been talking a lot about community, which is great, which is what your book revolves around ultimately. But you have so many absolutely intriguing stories in the book, from Herman Petty, the story of the first Black mayor in Cleveland, the unsolved homicide of Ernest Hilliard, and then Rabbi Hill's organization of the subsequent relentless protests afterward. Your book almost kind of takes this tone of a thriller or a murder mystery at times. How did you decide what to cut and what to keep?
Oh boy, that's a great one. One of the things that I struggle with, and I think, historians always struggle with, is, it takes so long to sometimes find a gem that you want it in the book, even if it has no place or any point. I talk for several pages about the market research that went into the chicken sandwich. I don't know if it was necessary for the book, but it was so fascinating to me. So it stayed in. And I actually appreciate the nod to, thinking of it as a thriller. I'm one of these people who engages critically, but still engages in a lot of true crime reading and podcasts. And I think about this a lot in terms of writing. What are the tools we have available to us to get a person from point A to point B? And sometimes it's the thriller. Sometimes it's the kind of illustrative example to open it up. But, one of the things that happens with McDonald's as it's trying to expand in Black communities, it causes a lot of chaos because it is this new brand, new in the sense to this community. It is a national brand, so people understand the prestige of it. And it's also a brand that is saying that they want to engage in Black economic empowerment. Well, everyone has a different vision of what that's like. And the stakes are really high because very soon after the first Black franchise owners are brought into McDonald's, people are understanding how financially lucrative this is. And people want in on this. And so I think, in many ways, at some points, the stories feel like ridiculous. Could you imagine negotiating on the terms of McDonald's in a neighborhood? People are armed, or, a mysterious bombing in McDonald's parking lot. Who did it? Everyone's kind of Everyone's nerves are heightened by this. And it's not because, they're being, overly dramatic or ridiculous. But I try to liken this. I was telling my students, the opportunity to franchise a McDonald's for an African American who has lived through Jim Crow segregation, has seen rapid change in the civil rights movement from Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregation of schools to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. If they are given the opportunity to franchise a McDonald's, it's like if Mark Zuckerberg called me right now while we are talking and says, Marcia, you can have Meta. It's that whole business. You own Facebook now, you own Instagram, you own WhatsApp. Do with it what you will. I couldn't wrap my head around that, right? And in the same ways, the economics of McDonald's ownership, from the perspective of someone living in 1970 who was shut out of every kind of major opportunity, whether it's home buying or business or, serving in a segregated military, gets this. Of course, people are going to kind of not know what to do with themselves. And I really want to bring that reality to readers to understand the importance of McDonald's as not just a global brand, but a representation and a symbol of kind of American, unbridled opportunity and capitalism, and what happens when that's brought to people who've been shut out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what happens with the evolution of those relationships over time? Even in McDonald's case in particular, we know that there are still redlining accusations and multiple lawsuits that continue even today. And it seems that the historical trends are also these modern day trends. And so I'm sure you're aware of the 50 plus Black franchisees that have sued McDonald's for redlining and discriminatory practices. And sometimes the facts of the case seemed like they were taken straight from the pages of your book. And
these are, I think that the fact that some of the arguments that McDonald's engages with its Black franchisees, the reason why, a lot of them haven't changed over 50 years, because I think at the center of it is, what really is the capacity for business to deliver on all of the kind of unfinished business and all of the needs of a community. It's not actually designed to do that, but people are still kind of searching for ways for it to accomplish these great feats. And so a lot of these, contestations over opportunity really does show that business ownership can only do so much.
One of our viewers, Clara, I think maybe just expanding on the relationship of McDonald's and not just Black franchisees, but other communities of color. Clara says, could you comment on fast food corporations' relationships in general with Black and or other communities of color these days? Do you see them trying to do similar things now when the country's view of fast food as a culinary genre is different than what it used to be?
That's a great question. I think that three things that I've noticed. One is McDonald's and then the rest of the fast food industry was among the first kind of actors to really engage in the kind of segmented ethnic marketing that we recognize today through television ads, through radio commercials, as well as through print advertising. And I talk about that in the book. I think what's happened now is that a lot of that has gone kind of online to even more tailored content. So you see it in the Twitter feeds, like Wendy's Twitter account, Popeye's Twitter account. A lot of it mirrors, or a lot of it parrots kind of like Black teenagers, kind of vernacular and slang. And so there's that. And I think that with the different platforms, you can do more targeted marketing towards audiences. I think that fast food really struggles to keep up with the category of fast casual. Now, for a few dollars more, you can get food that is perceived as healthier and more nutritious, even if it is or it isn't, is a big question. That's in an environment that is designed to be more sterile or to seem more kind of elevated. And so I think fast casual really kind of cut into fast foods market. And so I think what's happened is that there's so a little bit more class segmentation with fast food. So, as a college professor, I know a lot of people who are in my orbit who will say, well, I don't let my kids eat McDonald's, but they'll eat at Panera or Chipotle. Is the food healthier at these other places? That's not the question, but the environment is supposed to kind of give you a sense of a better diet or a more upscale fast food experience. And so people embrace it. So I think that there's more kind of both race and class segmentation when it comes to fast food. And then I think the fast food industry is also really struggling with the growing consciousness about worker conditions that are important to younger, or I should say all consumers, but I think younger consumers are more concerned about that. And they're also having to compete with the rise of ethnic foods that have become more fast casual. And so it's, having to experiment with flavors and marketing. And I think that even when these businesses lose market share, they're still able to have the resources to kind of try to pivot and to try to get more and more customers.
Yeah, and speaking of marketing, which you do talk about in your book, and the ephemera throughout the book, and the amazing photos that have surfaced over the years that take place at McDonald's, even the cover of the book. And then touching on having trouble keeping up with workers' rights, paying particular attention to targeted marketing to Black Americans, and even things like the Calvin campaign for working at McDonald's. Even what really truly sets McDonald's apart there as far as marketing goes?
Well, one of the things that I noticed very early, a large part of my research was just looking at old magazines and newspapers and looking at advertising for McDonald's in the Black Legacy publications, and then spending time at the Paley Library in New York City, just watching old McDonald's commercials, which made me so emotional. It's like I saw my whole entire childhood unfold in these, like cassette tapes or VHS tapes. But, one of the things that I thought was really fascinating about the ways that McDonald's marketed to African Americans is that a lot of the content wasn't about the food. It was about what McDonald's did on behalf of or for Black people. And so you would have ads about creating Black millionaires, about creating Black wealth, about employing Black youth, about sponsoring organizations like the United Negro College Fund. And it was about kind of what McDonald's can do rather than what McDonald's sells. And I think that we're more used to that now with the growth and the standardization of corporate responsibility campaigns and corporate social responsibility. But I think for the 70s and 1980s, McDonald's was doing something really distinct about suggesting that it was a member of the community, that it had the kind of significance of the organizations that it supported. And I think that goes a long way in really helping consumers, kind of feel connected to the brand. They were very smart to do that. And they had very smart people creating those campaigns. But as a result, McDonald's becomes a source of affect as much as it becomes a source of food.
Okay. What about within the McDonald's corporation itself? So you have Herman Petty establishes the National Black McDonald's Operators Association. And I know initially there were parameters around that, things that they could and couldn't do. But throughout history, what kinds of stance and involvement did they get into with McDonald's in civil rights?
Well, McDonald's has various affinity groups among its franchise community. The National Black McDonald's Operators Association was the very first. And this was a group that, had come from a lot of backgrounds. Some were college educated, some had business experience, some people just, seized this incredible opportunity. But they had to really kind of work as their own advocacy team, because although McDonald's recognized that they were very successful within the context of the Black neighborhoods in which they were able to establish stores, they didn't think McDonald's was really giving them the training, the resources, and the support they needed to expand. And so the National Black McDonald's Operators Association has really kind of been the most forceful of the advocacy groups within McDonald's, pushing for Black board membership, pushing for more advertising dollars in Black communities, pushing for the expansion of franchise ownership among its members and among African American recruits. And so, that modeling then inspires McDonald's Hispanic Operators Association. There's an Asian American Pacific one. There's one that represents the interests of women, and there's one that's focused on the LGBTQ community. But of all those groups, it's that National Black McDonald's Operators Association that I think very much was formed out of the sensibility of civil rights organizations that will, threaten the boycotts, really think about the lawsuits, will really, really push the organization, because I think they were born out of a particular moment where that was the strategy for delivering, measures and opportunities for success.
So speaking of tension, kind of segueing just to a more general topic between Black capitalism and actual economic justice. So what is the fundamental problem there?
Well, from my view, I think that although historically, African American leaders of a certain orientation have advocated for Black capitalism as a strategy to close the gap between, kind of the possibilities of the federal government and then the realities of living in a society structured by racism, that economic opportunity, that economic accumulation could close that gap, right? If we own our businesses, if we establish all Black towns, if we show that we can kind of participate within a larger capitalist structure, then we can make a case for our rights, or we can kind of use our capital to secure the things that we need, whether it's a school or a hospital or, some kind of standing in the justice system. Well, the fundamental problem with that is that it leaves behind the incredible mass of people who will not attain that kind of wealth. But what it does, it suggests that it's through wealth accumulation that people can have a place to stand on in order to ask for and to demand rights. And what happens, particularly in the late 1960s, and I think because of the pure exhaustion of all of the fights and battles around civil rights, is that Black capitalism sounds like a great plan for a lot of people. It creates this very strange group of people, from Richard Nixon to James Brown to the athlete Jim Brown, Wilt Chamberlain. All of these people are lining up behind the Nixon White House, not because they necessarily believe in Nixon or are members of the Republican Party. It's because Nixon is saying, well, I support Black capitalism too, but it avoids some huge questions about rights and equality, because Black businesses flourishing and opening doesn't do anything about schools or about fair housing or about job discrimination. It doesn't raise wages. It doesn't create healthcare opportunities. It does create businesses, and those businesses create a small number of jobs. And I think the thing that, just to kind of wrap this, you got me down my favorite rabbit hole. I think the thing that I wanted to kind of illuminate in franchise is to say that way of thinking, that business solves these problems in Black communities, is with us today. And I think we heard a lot of it after the George Floyd summer in 2020. And this is the kind of fundamental problem.
So it kind of sounds like then it's like a Band-Aid on a problem. And our lessons in history, if they're not teaching us anything, are they teaching these franchises, these corporations, anything? I mean, even McDonald's itself, contemporarily, the comments on a child being shot in the Chicago drive-thru being the fault of the parents, and just the callousness in which the comment was made.
Well, I mean, McDonald's has not texted me and asked me what I think they should do. I think that the the problem isn't just the kind of corporations not kind of understanding, but it's the federal government supporting, this idea that business ownership is a pathway, just like, home ownership is then a pathway, but home ownership without steady jobs, without, relief when people have to stay home because of a pandemic, without, thinking about the rights of renters, without really thinking about eviction laws doesn't do anything for people, right? It helps a very small number of people attain some class mobility at the expense of others. And so, what you have right now is a climate in which when we have these spectacular moments of racial unrest, whether it's 1968 after Dr. King's assassination or 2020 with the George Floyd summer, the calls for justice are very clear. People want an end to police brutality. They want affordable and quality housing. They want their children to go to good schools. They want to have public spaces in which people can enjoy themselves. They want healthcare. They want, wages that aren't poverty or starvation wages. Like, it's very clear what people want. And it's like the teacher in Peanuts, right? They don't hear what they're saying. And so someone will say, why don't you open businesses, right? Or why don't we support Black-owned businesses, or, on Instagram, Black creators? And that's fine. I mean, providing a space for Black businesses, I think, is fine. But I just want us to be very clear. It's not going to solve the problems that started this conversation. And just like the opening of Black franchises did not do anything to really deliver the things that Dr. King was talking about the day before he was assassinated. For all the people who are listening, do yourself a favor, go on YouTube after you listen to this talk and listen to Martin Luther King's last public speech. April 3rd, 1968, at Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. He is talking about the history of struggle. He starts in the Bible and he goes right up to the moment that he is in Memphis to support sanitation workers in a strike. And he talks about economic development and he talks about boycott, but he isn't saying we open businesses so some people can get rich and maybe it trickles down. He's saying that we work in solidarity, that we feel the pain when others are suffering because of economic injustice in order to deliver something more fruitful and more sustainable. And this is, I think, what we have not experienced or really delved into. And so you can open a McDonald's, that's fine, but don't suggest that one thing is actually a response to this other kind of, deeper and more structural thing. It's when people start to bring those conversations together, I start to get grumpy and I have to write this book.
Well, we don't want that. Or do we? Do we? Do we need another? We need another Pulitzer Prize winning book from Dr. Chatelain. Be angry more. So going into economic development and structure a little more, Kellen asks, how can we change the layouts of our cities so underprivileged people aren't limited to eating/purchasing processed foods?
Well, one of the things we have to really think about the subsidies that are provided for some businesses and not others. Supermarkets are a very kind of high risk, low margin business, right? You have a lot of food that isn't shelf stable. You have a lot of goods that once they get to the supermarket, they start to degrade and they have to be changed out a lot, right? The fast food industry has a supply chain, and the kind of food, right, that can be refrigerated and frozen and processed and has a stability that other food doesn't, right? So when we think about fresh foods and what it takes to support fresh foods in communities, it isn't just we have to have a supermarket open. We need a lot of square footage. We need a certain level of electricity. We need a lot to bring those businesses in. Now, the supermarket industry doesn't need more kind of subsidies necessarily, but if we're thinking about voting for candidates or getting involved in local initiatives that are about bringing businesses into the communities, we have to say, well, what businesses, for what purposes, and on what terms, right? Like, we can't say that we want more businesses and they are businesses that don't provide union jobs or businesses that don't contribute to the diversity of the food in our communities, because that isn't going to get us to where we want to be. And the other thing I think is that, decentralizing where you can get food. In Washington, D.C., where I live, I had the honor of serving on the board of DC Central Kitchen. And one of the things that, as a kind of food justice organization, they say, well, the supermarkets may not be built tomorrow, but what we can do is bring fresh food to the corner stores. And their corner store initiative has been really helpful in diversifying the availability of foods in the places where people are. I mean, I think in many ways, New York City struggles with some of this, but this idea that you can get fresh food at a corner store puts the kind of possibilities into it, right? What if we had fresh food distribution or fresh food markets at public schools, at hospitals, at bus stops, right? Like, where are we going to make it most convenient and most available and most affordable? We have to kind of rethink our models that food can only be in certain places and food should be distributed in certain places.
In New Orleans, there's produce in almost every corner store. So it's interesting that you made that remark, because I just think of it as something that is there. I can go to the corner store and grab something in a pinch.
Well, and then the other thing I will say about that is that then we have to make sure that people are not working a million jobs, that they can actually be home and cook food. And we have to make sure that, utility bills are affordable so people can still have refrigeration and pay their gas bills so that they can cook and prepare food. So again, the food justice movement is really alluring, because I think that, we all have foods that we love and we all understand the joy of sharing foods, but we have to make sure that structurally we're living lives where food can be part of our lives and not an afterthought, because we're stretched in so many directions.
Mm-hmm. So what does that then say about history and helping us to better understand that relationship between who we are and what we eat?
I think that the two things that I think are always really important to keep in mind is that people have struggled with food access and nutrition forever. That we are living in a moment where these questions about food and nutrition look a certain way, but I think people have always struggled with these questions. One of the things I try to emphasize when I talk about this book is to disabuse people of the notion that there was ever, a golden era of Black eating. African Americans, because of racism, have struggled with access to food, whether it's subsisting on whatever you can have as a sharecropper, to when African American migration brought a lot of Black consumers to grocery stores that would overcharge for low quality products. So, this generation of humans on Earth are not experiencing something that is totally unfamiliar. It just looks a little different. And the other thing I would say is that, when we are trying to solve a problem, history is the first place we go, or should go. We often don't. But it saves us a lot of time. It provides a lot of nuance, and it helps us kind of think through some of the potential pitfalls of our moment. I often tell my students, history is our greatest tool. Like, we have to use it when we want to make a change.
Yeah, and thinking of history not repeating itself and future generations, we did have a few questions toward the beginning that I want to make sure that we get to. It segues just a little bit. But Nate asks, how would you convey your research on this topic to engage high school students? And John asked something similar. How do you tackle the problem or lack thereof of the interest in history among children and teenagers? So I guess it's kind of a two-parter.
This is an interesting one, because I get this a lot from people. I hated history as a kid, and then I grew to love it. Some of it is the real need for historians like myself to support K through 12 history teaching, share best practices and ideas with teachers so that they can create that love of history. But I think the thing that high school students and children need the most is a vantage point into history that's relatable. I think that's one of the reasons why the American Girl dolls have been so popular, right? It historicizes, fictional childhoods to say, oh, if I was living during this time, what would this look like to me? One of the things that I like to do when I am with high school students is, I present a historical moment and then I have them look at it from every perspective, all of the actors, because I think that those are the moments where they can most engage in sharing their opinions, sharing their ideas, really weighing the fact that, history is about a certain view of the past. It isn't about a certainty about the past. Letting them engage with copies of primary documents, the visual culture of the past. Nothing gets teenagers more excited about my book than looking at ads from the 1970s and the 1980s and saying, oh my gosh, this is what people wore, and helping them kind of read the text. I think that part of the challenge of teaching history to any community, any age group, is to help them kind of become historically literate. When I look at this, what exactly am I looking for and what exactly I'm seeing? And so I think, that kind of active, engaged, visually interesting, kind of even tonally interesting material can really help get students excited about learning history.
Yeah. Is there one singular takeaway then that you would hope that students and readers in general would get from franchise?
I just want us to remember that there is a public good, that people have the capacity to care for other people in the context of community, that we do not need corporations' permission or blessing or intervention, that we can actually solve our own problems, and that businesses should focus on, providing goods and services, and people should be central to the process of taking care of each other and realizing the justice that we all desire.
Beautiful. What advice do you have for any aspiring writers or scholars that might be watching this talk today?
Writing is so hard, everyone. I don't care who you are. I mean, maybe everyone's confident writing and I'm not, but I think I'll say things. This year, the past 2 years have been incredibly strange. Never in a million years would I think that I would win the Pulitzer Prize in history. And I actually made a Pulitzer Prize joke on Twitter a few weeks before I won because it was just such a ridiculous idea to me. But this is what I will say. There's no way that I would have written the best book that I could have written without talking to people about my ideas. You can't write in isolation. You have to engage with other people. And I'm just so grateful that there were so many smart and thoughtful people who gave me feedback, who asked me really important, probing questions. And that, as a writer, you're so vulnerable and it's so exposing, but always remember that you have something to offer. Sometimes you'll say, oh, well, someone else wrote a book about this. Well, that's their book about it. We want to hear what your experiences and your view on the world has allowed you to kind of understand and share. I have an incredible privilege that I get to share my ideas with people. And if you're in the position to share your ideas, remember that every idea is an invitation for a person to learn more as well as grow more as a person. And if you can issue that invitation to people in your life's work, I mean, there's nothing better than that. So if you have something, please write, please share, please invite people into your ideas.
One last question before we end. Again, I'm going to circle back to the library. So what are you reading right now that you recommend that our viewers run to their library and check out immediately?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I'm reading like 5 books right now. Well, I'm reading, meaning reading 2 pages and then my son needs something. I'm reading Making Mexican Chicago by Micah Mesqua. It's about the history of Mexican Americans in Chicago, and it has a lot of themes like in my book, and it's from a historian friend, Micah Mesqua, Making Mexican Chicago, University of Chicago Press. I'm also reading a book by a guy, I think Bill Healy's his name, about Soul City, North Carolina, which was one of these kind of utopian Black cities that was both, private money and federal money. And it was supposed to be this kind of empowerment idea that didn't quite take off. I'm reading that book. And I'm also returning to Taylor Branch's book about the civil rights movement and Dr. King parting the waters.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time.
This was so great, Brandon.
Yeah, this was so much fun. And with that, I want to extend a huge thank you to all of our audience members for joining us and tuning into our author talk today with Dr. Chatelain. Without your support, none of this would be possible. And so we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream, you can find a link to decide where you would like to get Dr. Chatelain's book. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you all on August 9th when we talk to the New York Times bestselling author of Long Bright River, Liz Moore, and August 22nd in conversation with New York Times bestselling memoirist Dr. Michelle Harper about her book, The Beauty in Breaking. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us.